No one noticed when the Alpha's daughter slipped out after dark. They rarely noticed her at all. Not at court, not at council, not even at her own father's table. But every night she carried warm bread past the northern gates to feed a rogue the kingdom had abandoned. She thought he was broken. She never imagined he was a king. The cold came early to the northern reaches that year. It arrived not with storm but with silence, the kind that settled into the bones of a place and refused to leave, that turned every breath to vapor and every surface to glass. By the time the moon climbed past the ridge of black pines that framed the northern border of the Nightfall Pack's territory, the snow was falling in thick, unhurried curtains, blotting out the stars one by one. Lyara moved through it like she belonged to the dark. She kept her lantern shuttered, its small flame barely leaking through the gaps in the iron casing, just enough to avoid the worst of the roots beneath the snow. She knew this path by more than sight. She had walked it so many times that her feet had memorized the dips and turns, the place where an old oak root jutted up beneath the soil, the place where the path curved around a frozen creek bed that sang when the thaw came. She knew where the guards changed. She knew where the patrols thinned. She carried a basket over one arm, the weight of it familiar and quiet. Inside, thick-crusted bread wrapped in cloth, a clay pot sealed with wax that held a lamb broth she had coaxed from the kitchen hearth 3 hours before anyone else had risen, dried berries, a square of hard cheese, and at the bottom, tucked beneath everything else, a small jar of the healing salve she mixed herself from pine resin and snow root. She had been making this run for 2 months now. Winter had sharpened hunger into something desperate along the pack's outer fringes, and the rogues, those without home or standing, had no one to speak for them, no one except her. The clearing she sought was known to none but a few. It lay at the edge of the pack's formal territory, past the warding markers but before the true wildlands began, a kind of liminal space, neither claimed nor abandoned. An old stone wall ran along one edge of it, crumbling and moss-covered even beneath the snow, and it was here that the displaced wolves gathered in the worst of the cold. Not many, never many. 3, sometimes 4, once, memorably, 7. Tonight there were 2. She recognized the first, an old female named Senna, gray-muzzled, her human face carved with the lines of a hard life. Senna dipped her head as Lyara approached, a gesture between gratitude and pride that Lyara never acknowledged, because acknowledging it would have made it feel like charity, and it was not charity, it was simply what ought to be done. The second was new. He was sitting with his back against the stone wall, one leg stretched before him, the other bent at the knee. He was large, even seated, even in repose. His frame carried a kind of contained density that spoke of something more than ordinary strength. His clothing was worn, but not filthy, and that small detail snagged in her mind for a half-second before she let it go. Many rogues managed dignity in their presentation, even when they had nothing else. His hair was dark, pushed back roughly from a face that would have been strikingly well made if not for the scar that ran from the outer edge of his left brow down across the sharp plane of his cheek. An old scar, silver white against olive skin. Not from a blade, from claws. He was watching her, not with hunger, not with the hollow desperation she sometimes saw in new arrivals. He watched her with a stillness that was almost unnerving, the kind of absolute attention that made her feel simultaneously seen and examined. She did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching invited cruelty. Instead, she crouched before him, set the basket between them, and began to unpack. "You're new," she said. It was not an accusation. "Yes." His voice was low, measured. "Are you injured?" A pause. "Not seriously." She handed him the bread first, and then pried the wax seal from the pot and offered that too. He took it with both hands, steadily, she noted, not with the trembling urgency of true starvation, and for a moment she studied him openly, the way she had learned to read people the way others read weather. There was discipline in him, restraint. He ate without hurry, which was unusual. "What do they call you?" she asked. He considered this, as if choosing. "Rowan." Rowan, she tested the name. It suited him, she thought, something old and rooted in it. She gave him the salve last, setting it beside his knee. "For whatever you say isn't serious." His eyes dropped to the jar, then rose back to her face. Something moved in them, too quick to catch. "You come here often." "Often enough." "Alone?" "Yes." "That's dangerous," he said. "These are borderlands, rogue territory." "I know what they are." She began to repack the basket, leaving what remained for Senna. "I've never been harmed here." "You've been lucky." She looked at him then, directly, with the kind of quiet steadiness she had cultivated over years of being talked over and looked through. "Or perhaps the wolves I meet here are better than their reputation." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, more like recalibration, as if he had expected a different answer and was adjusting to the one she had given him. She rose. The snow was still falling. Above them, the moon hung full and cold, turning everything to silver and shadow. She pulled the lantern from her cloak and finally opened its shutter a little wider for the walk back. "Come back tomorrow," she said quietly, without turning. And he almost told her who he really was. The words rose in his throat, the true name, the title, the weight of it. And then the snow fell between them, and she was already moving through the trees, her small lamp swinging its pale arc through the dark, and he swallowed it back down and watched her go. The Nightfall Palace was not unkind in its architecture. It had been built in an older era, when the northern Alphas valued beauty alongside strength, and its high stone walls and arched windows and the deep amber-lit great hall spoke of a time when things like warmth and artistry had been considered worthy of a pack's resources. That warmth, however, had gone out of it 3 years after Lyara's father had taken a second mate. Queen Evelise of the Eastern Shores had arrived with a wardrobe of fine things and 2 daughters from a previous union and a particular talent for making her preferences felt without ever raising her voice. She was not a screaming tyrant. She was something more sustainable than that. She was a woman who understood how to wield atmosphere like a weapon, how to make a household reshape itself around her gravity without ever issuing a direct order. Within 6 months of her arrival, Lyara had moved from the family wing to a room beside the linen storage. Within a year, she was taking her meals with the household staff rather than at the family table. Within 2 years, it had simply become the order of things, unremarked upon, as if it had always been so. Her father noticed, she thought, or she told herself he noticed. He was not a cruel man, he was an overwhelmed one. And there was a difference, though the outcome felt similar from her side of it. He had loved her mother desperately and had never quite recovered from losing her, and Evelise had filled the absence with such efficient precision that questioning the arrangement felt ungrateful somehow. Lyara had watched this dynamic with the careful clarity of someone who could not be wrong about it, and she had made her peace, mostly. Mostly. The mornings were the hardest. Evelise's daughters, Kareth and Mel, both pretty in the particular way of girls who had never been hungry or ignored, occupied the solar off the great hall in the mornings, practicing their needlework and receiving their tutors, and occasionally playing instruments with a competence designed to be heard by anyone passing in the corridor. Lyara passed in the corridor most mornings, arms full of household linen or tray of tea or basket of whatever errand Evelise had manufactured for her. She did not hate them. She had tried hating them, briefly in the early years, and found it too expensive an emotion for what she got from it. What she felt on the mornings when Kareth's eyes followed her past the doorway with that particular blend of pity and satisfaction was something quieter, something she had no name for, the slow accumulation of small diminishments. She wrapped herself in competence instead. She learned the household entirely. She knew which servants were loyal to Evelise and which merely pragmatic. She learned which suppliers could be trusted and which inflated their counts. She managed the pack's charitable distributions from the back storerooms because no one else thought to, and she found that she was good at it, at seeing where need was sharpest, at stretching resources without waste, at making people feel seen when everything around them was designed to overlook them. She wore simple things. Her clothes were clean and well kept, but they were the clothes of a working woman, not a daughter of the Alpha. Evelise had never explicitly forbidden finery. She had simply ensured that Lyara's allowance was allocated to household expenses first, and what remained never quite reached the level of luxury. The one exception was the necklace. It had belonged to her mother, a thin chain of white gold from which hung a crescent of small, perfectly matched diamonds. Not ostentatious, the kind of jewelry that announced quality without shouting it. Her mother had worn it always and had pressed it into the 11-year-old Lyara's hands on the last night she was lucid, with a look that said more than her fading voice could manage. Lyara wore it under her clothing, against her skin, where no one could see it and no one could take it. Some nights, lying in her narrow bed with the cold coming through the wall from the linen room, she pressed her fingers to it and remembered being someone's most important thing. He came back, not just the next night, but the night after that, and the one after that, until his presence at the stone wall had settled into the rhythm of the thing, as expected as the cold and the snow and the pale lantern light. He was always there before her. She found this odd the first few times, and then simply accepted it as part of his nature. Whatever Rowan was, he was not the kind of creature who arrived late. The conversations began with small things, the weather, the particular quality of the cold that week. She asked once if he had shelter, and he said yes, tersely, without elaborating, and she did not press. She had long since learned that asking rogues where they slept was like asking them to count their wounds, technically answerable, pointlessly painful. But then the questions changed. It was the fourth night, or perhaps the fifth. The nights had begun to blur at their edges in the particular way of things that had become necessary, when he asked her without preamble, "Why do you do this?" She was portioning out food as he spoke, and she continued to do so, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because they need it," she said. "That's not an answer," he said. "Plenty of people know when others are hungry. That doesn't make them come out in the dark to fix it." She glanced up. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention she had come to expect from him, the focused, measuring kind that felt less like judgment and more like genuine inquiry, though the difference between those things sometimes required more than one conversation to establish. "Then I don't know how to explain it more simply," she said. "Something is wrong. I can do something about it, so I do." A silence. The snow fell between them in its unhurried way. "What do you get from it?" he asked then. "Nothing." She paused, then amended, "That's not precisely true. I suppose I sleep better." His mouth curved, not quite a smile, something more restrained than that, a relaxation at the edges. "Your pack doesn't know you're here." "No." "Why not?" She considered how to answer this. The truth was long and architectural, full of rooms she had not yet finished mapping herself. "Because if they knew," she said, finally, "they would make it into something it isn't. They'd want to decide whether it was appropriate, whether the recipients were deserving, whether I was spending the resources wisely." She broke off a piece of bread and handed it to him. He took the bread. His eyes did not leave her face. "What if we betray your pack?" he asked quietly. "What if someone tells where you go? What if someone uses your kindness to find a weakness in your borders?" The question hung in the cold air. She had thought about this. Of course she had. She was not reckless, and she was not naive. She met his eyes with hers, and whatever he found there seemed to make him go very still. "Then that would be a choice someone made," she said, "and they would carry it. But I won't make every hungry wolf pay the price of a sin they haven't committed, because I'm afraid of a sin they might." She paused. "I think most people, given enough of what they need, don't have reason to destroy the ones who gave it." The silence this time was different, longer. He looked down at the bread in his hands. "You are not what I expected," he said. She began to repack the basket. "What did you expect? Someone performing a virtue, someone who needed to be seen being good." The lantern flame bent in a small gust and steadied. "I'm quite accustomed to not being seen," she said. There was no bitterness in it. It was simply true, the way the cold was true and the dark was true. She rose to leave. He watched her the way he always did, with that absolute focused attention that she had begun, despite herself, to find steadying, as if someone's full regard was a kind of anchor. "Rowan," she said, at the edge of the clearing. "Yes." "Whatever brought you out here, I hope it resolves." She meant it. Rogue life in winter is hard. She didn't see his expression in the dark, but she heard the breath he drew. "Lyara," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She turned. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it." She nodded once, and then she walked back into the trees, and he sat with the warmth of the food and the weight of who he was, and the growing, unwelcome certainty that he was in profound difficulty. He stopped coming on a Tuesday. She didn't know it was permanent at first. She assumed weather, a storm had moved in from the northwestern ridge, and for 3 nights the snow fell so thick and sideways that even she had stayed inside, telling herself it would be foolish to go out in conditions that would blind her, telling herself she would go when it cleared. When it cleared, she went, and the stone wall was empty. Just Senna and a younger male Lyara recognized from the previous month, and the quiet absence where Rowan had been. She didn't ask immediately. She distributed food and sat for a while in the way she sometimes did when the nights were still enough, and eventually, when she was repacking the basket, she asked Senna, carefully casual, "The man who was here, the scarred one, Rowan, do you know where he's gone?" Senna looked at her for a moment. "He moved on," she said, "days ago. Just one morning he wasn't here." "Did he say anything?" "Rogues don't say much." A pause. "He wasn't really like the rest of us. I knew that from the start." Lyara nodded. She walked home in the dark without lighting the lantern at all, navigating by memory and the pale reflections of snow, and she told herself that this was fine, that she had always known the gathering at the wall was temporary, that caring about the people who passed through it was different from being owed their continued presence. She went back the next night and left a portion anyway, set beside the wall in the place he used to occupy, in case. The night after that she left another, smaller. She was not waiting, she simply left an extra portion, in the general way that one might when supplies allowed. By the end of the second week she had stopped leaving the extra portion, but she stayed longer than usual at the wall before walking home, in the particular stillness of someone who has decided not to look for what they're looking for. She dreamed about the conversation with the odd detail that dreams bring, not his face exactly, but the quality of his attention, the way his voice had shaped her name when he finally used it, the way he had looked at her as if she were something he was working very hard to understand, which was the opposite of most people who had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. She woke from those dreams practical and resolute and a little tired, and she went about her days, and she did not mention it to anyone, because there was no one to mention it to. The invitation arrived on a morning in early winter. carried by a formal courier in the livery of the Southern Kingdom. It was addressed to the Nightfall Alpha's household, and it summoned all unmarried daughters of the Northern royal bloodline to the Moonbound Convergence, the rare mate selection gathering of the great pack houses, convened this year at neutral ground by order of Alpha King Kaedric Voss of the South. Evelise read it at breakfast and spent the rest of the morning rearranging the world. Within hours, bolts of fabric had been ordered from the city. The best seamstress in the territory was summoned to the palace. Kareth and Mel were measured and draped and consulted at length on their preferences. The whole household revolved around their preparation like a solar system of silk and ambition. Lyara's name, however, was on the invitation. It had to be. She was the Alpha's firstborn daughter, whatever the practical realities of her position. And so she would attend, because Evelise was politically intelligent enough to know that exclusion would raise questions she did not want raised. But Lyara would attend on Evelise's terms. "You'll wear the gray wool," Evelise told her, 2 mornings before their departure, with the pleasant reasonableness that characterized all her decisions. "It's appropriate for the weather, and your duties will be to help the girls dress before the ceremony and to remain available should they need anything." "I'm a candidate," Lyara said. She said it quietly, the way she said most things, not as a challenge, but as a fact. "Of course you are," Evelise agreed, her tone implying that this was a formality and that they both knew it. "But your primary role—" "I understand," Lyara said. She did not argue further, but the night before they left, she went to the small locked box beneath her narrow bed and opened it, and took out the diamond crescent necklace and held it in her palm for a long moment, feeling its weight, its warmth, the way the stones caught even the dim light of her single candle and sent it back in 100 small directions. She had intended to wear it under her dress, as always, hidden. She put it on instead over her collar, where it would show, and looked at herself in the small polished mirror above the washstand, and something in her expression settled. In the morning, the necklace was gone. She searched for it with a calmness that cost her something. Her room had not been broken into. Nothing else was disturbed, but the necklace was not on the nightstand where she had laid it, nor in the small box, nor in any fold of her travel clothing. She stood in the center of her room for a full minute, breathing carefully, and then she put on the gray wool and braided her hair herself and went downstairs. The journey south took 3 days. Lyara spent them in the servants' compartment of the carriage, which was warmer than it might have been and quieter, which suited her. She watched the landscape change through the small window, the black pines giving way gradually to mixed forests, the snow thinning as they descended in elevation, the quality of the light shifting from the stark white of the north to something softer and more amber. The convergence grounds were held at the great neutral hall of Meridian, a structure from an older age, built on the joining point of 3 old pack territories, its stone corridors draped in the banners of every attending house. When Lyara arrived, she saw at once how it would be. The daughters of the great houses had arrived in force, wearing the colors of their packs and jewels that caught torchlight from across the room. Kareth had a gown of deep blue with silver at the throat. Mel wore green and amber. They moved through the gathering space with the easy assurance of girls who had been prepared for exactly this moment. Lyara stood at the edge of the room in her gray wool and watched. She had been told, growing up, that the Moonbound Convergence was about much more than appearances, that the Alpha King, whoever convened it, would walk among the gathered women and let instinct and destiny guide him, that the mate bond was not a thing that could be engineered by the right gown or the correct jewelry. She had believed this in the abstract way one believes things one does not expect to ever need. Now she stood in the gray wool with her plain braid and her bare throat, and she thought, well, we will see. The Alpha King arrived at dusk. She heard him before she saw him, not because he made noise, but because the room made noise around him. A subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure of the gathering, the way conversation faltered and reorganized itself, the way heads turned toward the great doors with something between anticipation and unconscious deference. He entered without fanfare. No herald, no elaborate procession. He walked with two figures slightly behind him, advisors or guards, it was hard to tell, and he was taller than she expected, with a presence that had nothing to do with height. He wore dark clothing, simply cut, with no ornamentation except a single clasp at his throat in the shape of a howling wolf worked in silver. His face was... She stopped. The room continued around her. The rustle of fabric, the indrawn breath of 24 hopeful families, the low murmur of protocol. None of it reached her. She stood very still, the way prey stands still, not from fear, but from the animal intelligence that understands something has changed. He was moving through the room in the way she imagined a tide moved, not rushing, not performing, simply progressing, with an absolute certainty that wherever he stopped was where he had intended to be. Women were presented to him as he passed, fathers with proud posture, mothers with bright, encouraging eyes, daughters with their best faces arranged. He regarded each one with courteous attention and continued. He was closer now, closer still. He walked past Kareth without slowing, and past Mel, and past the daughter of the Eastern Shore Alpha with her extraordinary jewels, and Lyara became aware, in a way that was almost physical, that he was going to reach her, that there was nowhere for her to step back to, that the gray wool and the bare throat and the plain braid were all she had, and they were what they were. She raised her chin, old habit. He stopped in front of her, and in the full, torchlit, witnessed silence of the Convergence Hall, Alpha King Kaedric Voss lowered himself to one knee. The room went absolutely still. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the small, involuntary sound that escaped from somewhere behind her, Evelise, she thought, with a distant, crystalline clarity. She could hear the snow that had started again outside the high windows, ticking softly against the glass. He looked up at her from where he knelt, and his eyes were the particular gray of deep water in winter, and she recognized them. She recognized them. "Lyara Nightfall," he said. His voice was low, measured, the voice of a man who had learned to contain enormous things in small spaces. She could not speak for a moment. When she found her voice, it came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Yes," she said. "Will you walk with me?" She looked at him for a long breath, at the scar that ran from the outer edge of his left brow down across the sharp plane of his cheek, an old scar, silver white, not from a blade, and she said, "Yes." The bonding ceremony chamber was small by palace standards, a circular room off the main hall, hung with dark fabric that absorbed the light of the candles arranged in a ring along the floor. It smelled of pine resin and beeswax, and the particular cold that lived in old stone even when fires were lit nearby. 2 chairs were placed facing each other at the room's center. They sat. The attendants withdrew. The door closed. Outside, she knew, the Convergence Hall had descended into the kind of stunned silence that precedes the rapid construction of a new understanding of events. In here, there was only the candle ring and the space between them, and the weight of what had not yet been said. She looked at him for a long moment. He was not attempting to control the room. He was sitting in the chair across from her with his hands clasped between his knees, and there was something almost careful in his stillness, as if he expected to be the one who had to absorb what came next. "You owe me an explanation," she said. Her voice did not waver. She was proud of that. "Yes," he said. "You were Rowan." It was not a question. She had known it from the moment she had seen his eyes in the torchlight of the Convergence Hall. She had known it in the bone-certain way of things one recognizes not because one was looking for them, but because something deeper than thought had been cataloging the evidence all along. The measured way he spoke, the particular quality of his attention. The night he had said her name for the first time, as if it were something he had been waiting to be permitted to use. "Yes," he said again. "I was Rowan." The silence stretched. She let it. There was something important about not filling it prematurely. "Tell me why," she said. He drew a slow breath. "I refused 3 political arrangements in as many years. My advisors ran out of patience and began constructing the Convergence without consulting me. I had concerns about the process, about what it would select for." He paused. "I believe that a true Luna must have compassion for those with no power to compel it. I believe the way a person treats the powerless tells you who they are, more completely than anything else." A beat. "I needed to know, before any ceremony, before destiny was announced to anyone. I needed to see it myself." "So you lied," she said. "Not cruelly, simply naming it." "I was truthful about everything except my name and my station." "Those are not small things." "No," he agreed, "they are not." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the candle ring on the floor. The flames were steady in the still air. She was sifting through the weeks of evenings at the stone wall, the conversations, the silences, the particular questions he had asked, testing her. She had known she was being tested in the abstract way one knows these things. She had not known the test was his. She had not known the whole construct of their meetings was an architecture of investigation. She thought about feeling used. She held the feeling carefully, turned it over, examined it. What she found underneath it was more complicated. "You could have simply sent people to observe me," she said, "at a distance, without the pretense." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He looked at her. For the first time since they had sat down, something broke open slightly in his face, a fracture in the controlled surface, something raw underneath. "Because I came back," he said. "The first night was reconnaissance. The second night, I told myself, was corroboration. By the third night, I had no justification I was willing to be honest about." He stopped, gathered himself. "I came back because I wanted to. Because the conversation was—" He seemed to look for a word and not quite find the right one. "Because talking to you was the only thing in several years that felt like it was happening in the real world, rather than the performed one." The candles burned. Outside, distantly, she could hear the murmur of the Convergence Hall resuming its life without them. "The night you first called me by my name," she said slowly, "you apologized. You said thank you. You said it like it had weight." "It did." "Because you were already—" "Yes," quietly. "Before any ceremony, before any formal recognition, before anyone else knew and before I had any right to." A pause. "I met my Luna in the dark, before she ever stepped into the light." The room was very quiet. Lyara pressed her fingers to the base of her throat where the necklace should have been and was not, and felt the absence of it like a small cold wound. And then she looked at the man sitting across from her, this extraordinary, difficult, careful man who had knelt in a crowded hall for her in gray wool, and she felt the betrayal and the understanding existing simultaneously in her chest, not canceling each other, but becoming, together, something more complex than either. "I will tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I thought about you when you stopped coming." She said it plainly, because she had long since stopped having the luxury of softening things for the benefit of her own dignity. I left extra portions at the wall for 2 weeks. I told myself it was a general practice." His jaw tightened. "I'm sorry for that. I had been called back. There was no way to—" "I know." She surprised herself with how much she meant it. "I'm not telling you to reproach you. I'm telling you because you told me something true, and I wanted to give you the same." She paused. "We both know what was happening at the wall, whatever name you were wearing." The fracture in his face widened. It was not distress, it was relief, which was more interesting. "The necklace," she said. He reached into the inner breast of his coat and produced it, the thin chain of white gold, the crescent of small matched diamonds. He held it across the space between them in his palm, and she could see from how he held it that he knew what it was, that he had been careful with it. "She would have kept it in the room somewhere your family could find it and decide it had been mislaid. I had someone remove it for safekeeping." She took it from him. The stones were warm from being held inside his coat, close to his body, which was stranger and more intimate than anything else in this strange and intimate conversation. She fastened it at the back of her neck with steady fingers. "You've been watching for longer than one evening," she said. "I wanted to be sure," he said simply. "And are you?" He looked at her across the ring of candle flame, this woman in gray wool who had walked alone through snow for strangers, who had looked a scarred rogue in the eye without flinching and told her that she would not punish the innocent for sins they hadn't committed, who had laid extra food at a cold wall for 2 weeks and told no one. "I was sure at the stone wall," he said. "I was sure before the snow stopped falling." The weight of a crown willingly carried. She did not agree immediately. This surprised him, she could tell. Not badly, not in the way of a man used to getting what he wanted, but in the way of a man who has genuinely prepared for every outcome and finds one still catches him off guard. "I need to understand what you're asking me," she said. "Not what the ceremony asks, what you are asking." He thought about this seriously. She liked that about him, that he could be asked to think and did not pretend he had already done so. "I am asking you," he said, "to be the other half of a very large responsibility, to share authority over a territory and a people, to stand beside me in the formal sense and be heard as equal in what matters. And if I disagree with you, then I would expect you to say so. And if I am right and you are wrong," something moved at the corner of his mouth, "then I would expect to eventually realize it and say so." She looked at him for a long moment. "I am not asking to be managed," she said. "I am asking to matter." "I know," he said. "I know exactly what you're asking, because it's the same thing I've been looking for someone to ask." She nodded slowly. "Then yes," she said, "with that understanding." The ceremony was brief and formal, and she did not remember most of it in the specific sense. She remembered the texture of it, the weight of the formal mantle placed over her shoulders, the coolness of the sigil ring on her finger, the particular quality of Kaedric's attention as he made the ancient oaths, with the same absolute focus he brought to everything, as if he was allergic to performing rather than meaning. She remembered what happened after. They walked back through the doors of the Convergence Hall together. The room, packed with nobles and diplomats and hopeful families and 2 half-sisters in their fine gowns, went very still at their entry. She felt the weight of every gaze like a physical thing. She had spent years learning to be invisible, and now the lights were on her with full force, and she was wearing gray wool and her mother's necklace, and she held herself the way she had always held herself at the wall, with the quiet steadiness of someone who has made peace with the dark and is not afraid of the light. She found Evelis in the crowd. The woman stood at the center of the room's polite confusion, Kareth and Mel on either side of her, and her face was a thing to study, not crumpled, Not dramatic, not the expression of a cartoon defeated villain. It was the face of someone recalculating. Someone watching the world rearrange itself according to rules she had not realized were in play. The slow, stunned dismantling of a certainty she had maintained for years. Lyara looked at her stepmother for a moment. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply looked, clearly and without flinching, the way she had always looked at things she needed to understand. Then she turned her attention to the room. "I should like to address the House representatives," she said, and her voice carried. She had not known it would carry that well, but the room was so quiet that it did not take volume to fill it. "Regarding the distribution standards for territories on the northern border, there are gaps in the current provisions for displaced wolves during winter months. I would like to discuss how they might be addressed." A beat of silence. Kaedric said nothing. He simply stood beside her with his hands clasped at his back, watching the room with the expression of a man who has been waiting for exactly this and is very satisfied with how it has arrived. The House representatives stirred. Someone cleared a throat. Someone else took out a ledger. The conversation began. Later, much later, when the hall had finally descended from ceremony into the more ordinary business of celebration and negotiation and the long work of politics, she and Kaedric stood at the high window that overlooked the grounds. Outside, the moon had risen full and winter bright over the snow-covered lawns. She felt the cold of the glass against her fingertips where she touched it. She was aware of him beside her in the particular way she had been aware of him at the stone wall in the last honest dark before everything changed. His warmth, his containment, the sense that he was paying complete attention to everything while appearing to do nothing except stand. "You knew I would do that," she said, "the moment we walked in." "I hoped," he said. "You had to hope? You've been very sure about most things." "I was sure about what you are," he said. "I was not sure you had realized it yourself yet." She looked at him sidelong. "And now?" "Now," he said, and something in his voice had softened to the texture of the thing he had said at the stone wall in the last honest dark before everything changed. "I think you're beginning to." She turned back to the window. The moon lay over the snow like something poured. Her necklace glowed faintly in its light, or perhaps that was only the quality of the moment, the way certain moments make ordinary things luminous. She thought of the path through the dark pines, the shuttered lantern, the weight of the basket, the particular silence of a clearing where the hungry waited, and the way it felt to arrive and have it not be empty. She thought, "This is also a clearing, and I have arrived." "I have a condition," she said. "Name it." "The provisions for displaced wolves along the border, I will manage them directly, not through a committee, not through an advisory structure that takes 3 months to decide what is already obvious." "Done," he said, without hesitation. "And I want to go back to the wall," she said. "Once the winter passes and the emergency is managed, I want to go back and tell Senna myself." He was quiet for a moment. "Tell her what?" "That things are going to change," Lyara said, "and that I meant it when I said they would." Below them, through the high glass, the grounds of the Convergence Hall lay silver and still in the moonlight. The snow held every footprint that had crossed it tonight. The beautiful daughters in their fine gowns, the advisors in their formal coats, the guards at their posts. And somewhere, out at the edge of it all, she imagined, the deep darkness of the tree line, the places that the light of the hall did not reach. She had always lived in those places. She had learned to carry her own light there. Now she carried it somewhere it would be seen. Kaedric was looking at her profile in the reflected moonlight, and whatever he saw there made him exhale very slowly, as if he had been holding something for a long time and had finally been given permission to set it down. "Luna of the South," he said quietly. "Not a title, a recognition." She touched her crescent at her throat, her mother's stones, warm like living things, catching the moonlight and bending it back, and she thought of a woman she had loved entirely and lost too young, who had pressed a small jewel into a child's hands and looked at her with the look of someone who knew exactly who she was sending into the world, who she was sending and what she would become. The necklace glowed. Or perhaps, yes, certainly, it had always glowed, and she had simply been wearing it in the dark. This story began with a question I couldn't stop asking. What if the most powerful person in the room had spent years being treated as invisible? Lyara Nightfall is not a chosen one. No prophecy marks her. No magical bloodline sets her apart. She is distinguished entirely by what she chooses to do, night after night, in the cold and the dark, when no one is watching and no reward is coming. That, to me, is the most radical kind of heroism there is. Many of us have lived in some version of Lyara's world. We have sat at the edges of rooms where others were centered. We have been overlooked, underfunded, passed over by families, by institutions, by people who decided what we were before we opened our mouths. We have worn the gray wool when we deserved the diamond necklace and told ourselves it was fine because we had learned that asking for more invited more diminishment. If that is your story, this chapter of it does not have to be your whole story. Your contributions do not require an audience to be real. Your worth does not require consensus to exist. There is a necklace in this story. A thin chain of white gold, a crescent of small diamonds. It is not a dramatic object. It is not magical or legendary. It matters because a dying mother pressed it into a child's hands and looked at her with the face of someone who knew exactly what she was sending into the world. We all carry something like that, a value, a memory, a standard someone held for us before we could hold it for ourselves. Sometimes that inheritance is the only thing that tells us who we are when everything else is trying to tell us otherwise. Lyara wears her necklace against her skin, hidden for years, because it is too precious and too vulnerable to display in a household that takes things from her. There comes a moment when she puts it on over her collar where it will show. That moment costs her something, and something is taken from her for it. And she wears it anyway the next time. I think that is what courage looks like in ordinary life, not a single dramatic act, but the slow, repeated decision to let yourself be seen as who you really are, even when experience has taught you that visibility has costs. The story ends not with a wedding or a celebration, but with Lyara addressing the House representatives about provisions for displaced wolves on the northern border. She has just been recognized as Luna of the Southern Kingdom in front of an audience of dignitaries. She has just witnessed the quiet collapse of years of her stepmother's social architecture. Power in the hands of someone who has known powerlessness is a remarkable thing when that person has not become bitter, when they have not let the years of being overlooked turn them into someone who overlooks others in turn. Lyara's survival of her circumstances has not made her hard. It has made her specific. She knows exactly what she would have needed, and she builds it. That is what I hope for you. Whatever you are building, in your family, your community, your work, your art, I hope you build it with Lyara's specificity. Not vague goodwill, but the particular, practical, unglamorous work of showing up in the dark with warm bread and saying, something is wrong here, and I can do something about it, and so I will. The necklace glows at the end of this story. Or, as Lyara herself corrects, it always glowed. She was simply wearing it in the dark. You are not waiting to become someone worth recognizing. You already are that person. The world catching up to you is a separate matter entirely. Keep feeding the wolves. Keep carrying the light. Keep going back to the wall, even when it's empty for a while.
the path through the dark pines is one worth knowing by heart. Until next time, keep on shining, and may you find love and purpose even when you least expect them.